Hello and welcome to our last discussion of natural law theory. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at kind of a more critical analysis of the theory. Now remember that our theory thus far has given us a theory of the right, which states that an action is right if and only if failing to do it would result in a direct violation of one or more basic goods. We got to this particular form of our theory of the right after we went through and understood our principle of double effect, which again is a decision-making procedure that we utilize in this theory whenever we come across actions which may have at least one good and one bad effect. Our theory of the good that we discussed in our first lecture came from an understanding of human nature that was heavily influenced by Aristotelian logic. And that according to rational observation of human behavior, we were able to determine that there are four basic goods that help to perfect human nature, these being life, procreation, knowledge, and sociability. Now remember that we had three major components of natural law theory. Moral absolutism, again, that certain things are absolutely wrong no matter what. The principle of double effect, again, our decision-making procedure that helps us figure out moral dilemmas. And our third, value and moral perfectionism. That is that there are things about human nature that we should continue to work to perfect, our certain capabilities and so forth, and that we can understand these through rational observation. Now, Timmons argues that it may be possible to accept any one of these while rejecting the other two. So let's take a look at this as well. We see several advantages to the theory, at least initially. One is that it appears to be intuitively appealing, as it seems to ground morality and facts about human nature. Well, it seems like there are important things about who we are as humans, things that define us as human, and that this should have some type of influence and some type of role in terms of developing morality. So at least initially, this appears to satisfy grounds for intuitive appeal as well as external support. We also kind of enjoy the fact that this is a non-relativist theory, that it's going to say that there are reasons why we should be able to judge interculturally different actions. Through the PDE, it appears that we can satisfy the consistency and determinacy standards. It seems that across a wide variety of cases, I can get consistent answers and deterministic answers. Now, for a good example of this, take a look at section 10 of your chapter in moral theory. In that particular section, Timmons discusses the hysterectomy and craniotomy example, as well as self-defense. Additionally, it seems that application of the theory seems to give us intuitively correct implications across a variety of cases. That is, that we see some internal support from this. But let's question each one of these different areas. Now, with regards to moral absolutism, we have some very basic and fundamental questions that we have to ask. First off, how do we rationalize or justify the rightness or wrongness of these exceptionalist rules? This is going to be particularly difficult for us. After all, if we cannot justify why necessarily certain actions are wrong no matter what, then the moral force of the intellectual force, the academic force, the logical force of those rules seems to be difficult. There seem to be plenty of cases in which violating these seem to work. Timmons discusses, for example, the killing of Thomas Uke by through physician-assisted suicide. Now, it's a really important question to ask in situations such as situations of physician-assisted suicide, whether or not it's important for us, or whether or not we should be looking at, are there exceptional situations whereby helping a person to end their life in the face of terminal illness seems like it could be important. It seems like it could be important for us to try to understand why we would say that it's not permissible to do so. But there may be other situations whereby it appears that it could be. And then furthermore, we have to ask if it's irrational to have absolute commitment to exceptionalist rules. To illustrate this, Timmons gives us an example from Bernard Williams. follow this situation. Jim finds himself in the central square of a small South American town. Tied up against the wall are a row of 20 Indians, most terrified, a few defiant, in front of them several armed men in uniform. A heavy man in a sweat-stained khaki shirt turns out to be the captain in charge, and after a good deal of questioning of Jim, which establishes that he got there by accident while on a botanical expedition, explains that the Indians are after recent acts of protest against the government are just about to be killed, and to remind the other possible protesters of the advantages of not protesting. However, since Jim is an honored visitor from another land, the captain is happy to of killing one of the Indians himself. If he accepts, then as a special mark of the occasion, the other Indians will be let off. Well, in this situation, if we have this prohibition against killing that is absolute, then it would appear that Jim cannot engage in this act, which may end up saving the life of 20 Indians. However, it also seems like it's absurd to argue that he would have to necessarily violate his own moral principle about this. This is a good example of a situation in which we may have to ask, is it permissible to do something which may be morally wrong if it's going to lead to some type of greater good? If we have a commitment to absolutism, it's going to be very difficult for us to justify this. Or it may look like following an absolutism or absolutist version of theory may not work very well. It may be fairly implausible because we may come across a number of situations whereby a commitment to this absolutism ultimately may lead to unethical actions. Now, with regards to the principle of double effect, a very important question has to be asked. How can we discriminate between intention and what is merely foreseen? So again, let's assume that the craniotomy case. This is a case in which, again, a pregnant woman who is going to have to abort her pregnancy in order to save her life is given a situation whereby she can only do this through craniotomy. And craniotomy is a surgery in which, in essence, the fetus's head is deflated through surgery in order to allow the fetus to be safely delivered. In some situations, this is required in order to save the mother's life. Now, we can describe the situation in a lot of different ways. We could describe the action as the crushing the skull of the unborn child, where the immediate end is to the removal of a life-threatening object, where the side effect is the death of the unborn child, and the sought-after end is saving the woman's life. Or we can describe it in the following way. Our action is killing the unborn child, the immediate end is the removal of a life-threatening object, and the sought-after end is saving a woman's life. Well, this is going to be pretty difficult for us to determine because sometimes it appears that we may be able to describe certain actions in ways that make them seem more morally plausible than other actions. Additionally, if I go through and say my intention is to save the woman's life, and I can foresee that this may involve the killing of the child, do I actually intend the killing of the child in that situation? This question of internal psychology is going to be very difficult because ultimately when we're asking questions about intentionality, we're trying to get in the third person's head, and it's going to be difficult for us to do so. In this, we need to ask questions about moral perfectionism. Aquinas' attempt to ground morality in perfectionism appears to be logically circular. That is, that we can't observe the good without defining it beforehand. So if life, knowledge, procreation, and sociability are goods, ultimately we come across a significant problem here. Because in order for us to see these things as good, we had to, a priori, define them as good. We had to be very selective in terms of defining what's good versus bad, in terms of what type of inclinations we have as humans. Therefore, we need to ask this fundamental question: can rationality, but not human nature, give us rightness or wrongness? Which would allow us to avoid, perhaps, circularity. Now, if we can do this, this may lead us to some different situations. and different understanding about rightness or wrongness. Additionally, when we look at the question of conflict, we also are not certain how we should decide which rule or value we should follow when we come across conflict. If I have a conflict between two values, and it appears that I may have to make a choice, the theory doesn't give me a good way of doing so. Again, if the values are incommensurable, I cannot necessarily state that, well, one thing is going to bring about more of one than the other, and that I should base my decision to act on that. As such, how do I move forward? How do I choose? And it looks like moral judgment appears to become our decision-making procedure. That is, that the PDE may be able to get me to a certain point, but in order for me to truly choose my action, judgment is going to come in. That's going to end up leading to problems with determinacy, because the principle of double effect may not be able to give me determinate moral answers. I may get a number of rules that come out of it, and then I have to choose from there. And then lastly, let's look at the question of sensibility. Now, in essence, moral perfectionism tells us that the rightness or wrongness of an action is based on how it affects perfectionistic value. But we should ask whether or not this value is really central to ethics. Welfare may be more of a primary concern than our perfection. That is, what makes my life worthwhile, what makes my life good, may be a better consideration morally than promoting life, knowledge, procreation, or sociability. And furthermore, if I achieve some sense of moral perfection, does this really seem to better my life? This is an important question that we'll revisit several times throughout the semester. When we come down to our final determination about natural law theory, we see some problems. It appears to be very difficult to ground morality in human nature or ideas of perfection. And moral absolutism gives us unsatisfactory answers, and PDE doesn't give us enough direction on how we should define actions. Therefore, we lose quite a bit. We lose what initially appeared to be a remarkably robust theory, because we lose intuitive appeal, internal support, and explanatory power. Now, as Timmons shows us, we may be able to take different elements of the theory and utilize those, maybe what he calls a limited moral pluralism. We may be able to utilize certain ideas here to give us something that ultimately seems to work for us.